Well, apparently, the same thing is true of prophets that has always been said about the division of labor between folks in a marriage. And that is that a man's work is from sun to sun, and a woman's work is never done. Well, it seems like a prophet's work is never done either. And along with the faithful prophet, there seems to be in Isaiah 62 uh, those who are called to watch for their enemies. And they don't seem to get a quick respite from their efforts either. So I chose this background because of the silhouette of the sentinel on the wall. So you might remember that in Nehemiah 4:16, all the men that were working on the wall were accompanied by fully armed and armored bodyguards. And that was because the enemies of God's people faced armed opposition trying to rush the gaps in the walls before they were finished. For one attack, Nehemiah even gathered old folks and women and children and prepared to defend a gap right there in the wall. So at this point in time, the prophet is saying we need armed watchers on the wall. But Nehemiah had eventually placed armed watchers alongside builders so that you had builder, watcher all the way around the wall. So remember that we are now in the sweet spot, the yellow marking in the circumlocutus bookends envelope chiasmus structure that we've been looking at in this last part of Isaiah. And these three chapters, 60, 61, and 62, are all about God's promises coming true for Jerusalem. And maybe as we study them, we'll experience some of God's promises coming true for us as well. But as God's city and as God's people, we're finally beginning to see the promises move toward fruition. What we see is that there's still work for the people to do. And after this chapter, the themes are going to alternate between promises and laments and warnings. So, as is our tradition, I want to give you two overviews of this chapter. So, first, my old Hebrew professor, Paige Kelley, and then Brevard S. Childs' similar but slightly different approach. So, you'll immediately notice that Dr. Kelley breaks the section at verse 5, while Childs breaks it at verse 7. And that's because Dr. Kelley sees the divine speech being quotations that are just embedded in prophetic speech, or maybe even in that of the watchman, while Childs sees verses 8 and 9 as specifically representing God's direct speech. So Dr. Kelley breaks it down, as you can see on your screen, that he is pleading the promise of God. And the first thing he talks about is how desolated, devastated, abandoned, forsaken Judah and Jerusalem is now going to be Beulah land. And we'll talk about what that means when we get to that verse. And then he challenges the watchman to a prayer vigil that should tell us a few things to undergird our understanding of intercessory prayer. And then he talks about the highway of the redeemed, an outreach responsibility that that comes to God's people, and that's why the saved are never done. So Kelley focuses on God's promises for the land, followed by the prayer work that still needed to be done, followed by a call for any exiles who still hadn't come back, as well as any Gentiles who believed in the cause, to make their pilgrimage. to the holy city, the New Jerusalem. Now, Childs recognizes that the older commentaries, such as Franz Delish's, sees God as speaking all the way through the passage. And 19th century commentators like Franz Delitzsch believed that, and the 20th century commentator August Piper believed that. But part of the argument here from Delitzsch in particular is that it's usually God who keeps silent in the Hebrew Bible, and that he keeps silent as a result of judging the people as not being worthy of a word of the Lord. And he wants them to become hungry and thirsty for a word from the Lord. But Childs points out that the preponderance of the use of the idea of God as silent is related to God judging the people. So maybe in this case, it could be God not keeping silent because his judgment is already over. After all, earlier in the book, it said Israel has paid double for her sins. So he's not judging, but why would God keep on petitioning himself to get this rebuilding finished? And why the references to Yahweh in third person in both verse 2 and verse 3? It really makes much more sense as a prophetic oracle, as a sermon from the prophet. In fact, the direct speech from God seems to be in verses 8 and 9, and then it seems to go back to prophetic exhortation with the prophet now urging the people to go out and make the way ready for the exiles that are going to come in. So that's the way Dr. Kelley sees it. Dr. Childs sees it this way. Verses 1 through 7, the prophet proclaims and petitions. It's the prophet speaking. In 8 and 9, it's Yahweh's response to the prophet's petition. And then in 10 to 12, it's the reverberations of former promises as it comes to be part of an exhortation to get to work now. And I also see a structural clue in the text itself for believing that verses 1 through 7 go together, as Dr. Childs believes here. So there are phrases that seem to form an inclusio, those bookends or the envelope that we always talk about. So look at what the prophet says about himself in verse 1. I will not keep silent, in part A of the verse, until her, Jerusalem's righteousness, is brought out like a brightness. And then contrast that with the watchmen that have been appointed to keep watch on the wall. They shall not keep silent. In verse 6a, until, in verse 7b, he, God, establishes Jerusalem as praise in all the earth. Now, whether we're talking about the prophet or appointed leaders, what they were supposed to be was persistent in reminding God and themselves of what God's plan actually is intended to be. Now, this commitment is refusing to be silent until God finishes the job. And that really should remind us not to depend on fire and forget prayers, because intercession or voicing petitions on behalf of others is not an easy job, because we have to keep repeating them. We don't keep repeating it because God's hard of hearing, and we don't keep repeating them because God's indifferent to what we're asking from him, but this is because our reaffirmation of God's will strengthens us, as well as the fact that asking over multiple times gives us time to sharpen our understanding of God's will. So it's a relational interaction. Well, as you can tell from these introductory words, I believe, as does Dr. Kelley, that the prophet is the one who will not keep silent or be quiet for the sake of Jerusalem in these first verses. So let's look at these first verses. For the sake of Zion, I will not keep silent, and for the sake of Jerusalem, I will not keep quiet until her righteousness, or there are some other ways you could translate that, is brought out like brightness, and her deliverance like a burning torch. Now, you may have noticed that I translated righteousness, where a lot of interpreters and translations make it vindication. And Childs himself does that. The New Revised Standard Version does that. The Revised Standard Version. Some make it salvation, like Piper. Some make it victory, like the Good News Bible. Some make it legitimacy, like John Watts. And others just stick with the root idea of righteousness, like myself and the English Standard Version, the King James Version, Elmer Leslie, and the New American Standard Bible. Stick with righteousness. Now, it is vindication when God's people are discovered to be righteous. And they are legitimate when they're following God's will that's expressed in the Torah. And it is salvation because God saves us for a purpose, to live right with Him and with others so that we can flourish. And that's where victory comes from. But the reality then and the reality now is that God's people have been called to righteousness. And whatever God does in the life of the nation of Israel of post-exilic times, and whatever God does in the church today, is going to be predicated on expecting righteousness. Of course, we've seen this light imagery in Isaiah multiple times at all three major sections of the book. And it's true. When people see that we're sincerely dedicating our lives to conforming to God's will, they'll see us as worthy of giving counsel, worthy of befriending, worthy of trusting. And that's very much the idea of legitimacy, as Dr. Watts translates it right there. Indeed, a 19th century translator, George Adam Smith, said, the people's righteousness is described in external fashion, a righteousness that people can see, a righteousness that people can react to. And he says that righteousness is salvation because we're free to break from evil. And when we break from evil, it is quite visible to those around us. And then the next verse demonstrates that visibility. The nations will see your righteousness or your legitimacy, your vindication, your salvation, your deliverance. And all the kings, your glory, your significance, your influence, your power. And a new name will be declared that belongs to you, which the mouth of Yahweh will give. Now, we know that the ancients considered names to be very significant. They represented one's character, one's status, and going forward, one's reputation. The names themselves had meaning. Avram, great father, since he would be. Jacob, heel grabber, cheat, because that's the way he started off. Daniel, my God is judge, to show where his obedience would lie. And David as beloved, since that's what he was to God. Well, even today, names have value. That's why corporations want a distinctive name with some cachet to the branding possibilities. That's why criminals often go by aliases to be able to function in more than one layer of society. And I know this from experience because adopting our middle son was a big deal. He was originally Albert Ramos, son of a felon in a federal penitentiary, and had a mother who was a drug addict and sold herself on the street in order to pay for it. And he absolutely hated the name Albert. So when we fostered him, I told him that if the adoption worked out, he could change his name. And I was thrilled when he chose Jonathan Lee Wilson because it was pretty close to my name, Johnny Lee Wilson. But he also had this idea of lazily spelling his name with three letters as John, Jon. And anyway, this is a picture of him with the judge when the adoption was formalized and he officially became Jonathan. Now, he had a friend down the street with a funny accent. The friend couldn't say Albert, so he called him Albert. And he came to the door and he asked if Albert could come out and play. And we told him that he could come out and play, but he wasn't Albert anymore. Now he was Jonathan. And the little kid got indignant. You can't change your name. I said, you can if you go to court and you have it changed legally. The court gives you a new name and you can use it for everything. Well, better than having the Honorable Judge Richard Ibanez change your name, Judah, Jerusalem, had her name changed by the very mouth of God himself. Now, a new name gives you a chance to disassociate from bad influences, from your former misjudgments and a bad reputation. Well, God provided all of that for Jerusalem, Judah. And we're going to see some new names in verse 4, but here in verse 2, we're clearly seeing the idea of renaming to get a new status, a new identity, while the names in verse 4 are clearly intended to be predictive. And remember last session, we're not through with that wedding garment imagery here. And this setting would explain the reference to the crown and the royal diadem in verse 3 and how Zion is envisioned as the bride at the wedding in verse 4. So Jerusalem will be adorned with the appropriate garments of a bride in an Eastern wedding, and God would choose to become the bridegroom. God's people are back in an intimate relationship with their God. And you will become a splendid diadem in the hand of Yahweh, and a royal or wedding turban in the palm of your God. You will no longer be spoken of as abandoned, and concerning your land, not as devastated, because you shall be called Hephzibah. My pleasure is found in her. And your land, Beulah, married. So for more on that wedding imagery, consider Proverbs 12:4 as the picture of a wife as the husband's crown. And regarding the church as the new Israel, consider how Paul describes the church at Philippi in Philippians 4:1 and the church at Thessalonica in 1 Thessalonians 3:19 to be his crown of rejoicing. Now, several old translations, like the King James Version, maintain the literal names Hephzibah and Beulah. And indeed, even a mid-20th century translation retains the traditional names, albeit with some footnotes. So the reason for this imagery is clear. In many ancient and primitive civilizations, they believed the powerful God must marry the earth goddess in order to have good crops and health and prosperity. Instead, God chooses to have an authoritative and intimate relationship with his people. Yet, here, as elsewhere in the scriptures, the receiving of a new name is going to signify a radical change in Israel's character and status. Now, Childs is troubled, however, with tying a wedding between Yahweh and his people, though there are many places in Scripture, in Hosea, Jeremiah, and here in Isaiah, where that occurs. But Childs worries that we might get the wrong idea from verse 5. Because as a young man marries a virgin, your sons will marry you. And as the bridegroom celebrates concerning the bride, your God will celebrate concerning you. Does that mean God celebrates incest? Because if you take it literally, that's what you've got. But we really need to shift to another interpretation. And Childs cites one interpreter who sees these sons as representing those whom the prophet is calling back from exile to come through the gates of Jerusalem at the end of the chapter. Yet, my favorite solution is a minor change in the word beneh, or sons, to benah, or builder. Because the idea of marrying your builder or your creator is much more appealing than the idea of marrying your sons. So before we shift to something completely different, let's consider an important point from Westermann. Because he says, in the large number of Old Testament passages that use the metaphor of marriage to describe the relationship with God, God's partner is always a community and never an individual. So this means the relationship is invariably expressed always from the divine point of view. And that communal relationship between God and God's people also works for the new Israel, the church. Piper explains it well in a second. The church will be a glorious diadem, a regal turban, a royal crown in the hand of the Lord. The kingly crown here represents the most glorious and beautiful ornament available. It's an ornament made of the most costly materials, and it's a sign of the most exalted human dignity. Then why do so many translations just read this as talking about Hephzibah and Beulah land? Well, Beulah is Hebrew for the idea of being married. Now, as noted just a few moments ago, if God's people have a marital style commitment toward God, then there's going to be tremendous blessing for those who are living in a proper, committed relationship with God. And so, as a result, you can see from the cover here of the best-selling novel called Beulah Land, as well as the cover of the CD that has the mini series on it from television based on the novel. You can see that the idea of Beulah Land is being used to describe a lush and productive plantation. Now, of course, the novel and the miniseries had it backwards. In those, the plantation was lush before the raiders came and oppressed them. But Jerusalem was raided before God promised to make it Beulah land. Also, I remember dating a girl in a missionary Baptist church where they sang the hymn Beulah land. It had become a symbol of heaven at that point. And the hymn is inspired by our text. It even mentions the grain and the wine that we're going to see Yahweh speak to in verses 8 and 9. So Beulah land means lush and lavish. And the prophet in this latter part of Isaiah, the prophet really meant the idea that when you're in a relationship with God, God makes you flourish so that the people and the products and the land and the purposes all around you are able to flourish. But in that hymn, what it's telling us is that Beulah land is heaven. But you're not going to get to heaven unless you have that relationship with God, that ongoing, ongrowing relationship that enables you to flourish. So the prophet goes on. Upon your walls, Jerusalem, I have appointed watchmen all day and all night. They shall not be silent. The ones remembering Yahweh, don't rest yourselves, and don't give him rest until he rebuilds and until he establishes Jerusalem as praise upon the earth. Now, we don't usually think of literal watchmen on the walls being noisy, but in this illustration, they're supposed to be informative to people, and they're supposed to be petitioning toward God. Quote, the prophet announces to Jerusalem that he's placed watchmen upon her walls to engage in perpetual prayer on her behalf. They therefore represent all those who join with the prophet in the ministry of intercession, end quote. So these watchmen are the prophets, the preachers, the spiritual watchmen who guard and watch over the church lest it suffer a needless injury. So their unceasing calling is intended either to summon the citizens to put their hands to the rebuilding of Zion, for by means of their own labor, God does intend to accomplish the glorification of Yahweh, or the prophet is calling them to exhort the heathen converts who are streaming to the city to get involved in the work of glorification. But why intercession? Well, I liked what Dr. Kelley said, that our common humanity binds us together in such a way that we're able to reach out in prayer or draw others into the presence of God, whether they're aware that we're praying for them or not. Because intercession, therefore, is to be seen as a sign of the inseparableness of our human lives in their relation to God. Yahweh swears by his right hand and by means of his mighty arm. Quote, I will not give your grain again for the consumption of your enemies, and I will not give offspring of foreigners your new wine for which you worked, because the ones gathering harvest shall consume it. And in relation to that, they shall praise Yahweh. And the ones harvesting it, the grapes, shall drink it in my holy courts. Now, some of you are probably wondering what's going on. Jesus taught us not to swear. Don't swear by heaven or by earth or by the throne of God. But here's God himself swearing an oath to make a guarantee? Well, all I can tell you is we shouldn't swear because we don't have perfect knowledge. We don't know the consequences of our actions. We don't know our limitations. So we can get in trouble even when we think we can do something, and God doesn't want us to end up in that situation. But notice how God swears. God swears on his own power because his omnipotence, backed by his being anywhere, omnipresence, and his knowing everything, omniscience, except for where he self limits, because God can put limits on himself if he wishes. So finally, with the conceptual echo of preparing the way in Isaiah 40, we come to the last part of this chapter, which is preparing the highway for the redeemed, the returnees, to come back. And so as we read, keep in mind that the gates are the gates of Jerusalem, and that the prophet uses warm, telling words to speak potentially to Jews everywhere in exile in the entire Middle East. Although, really, let's face it, only his immediate hearers can actually do anything. So go through the gates, free from obstacles the way for the people, build up the highway, free it from the stones, lift up a banner over the nations. Check it out. Yahweh has caused it to be heard to the ends of the earth. Say to the daughter of Zion, check it out, your salvation is coming. Check it out, his reward is with him, and his paycheck goes back before him. And in relation to that, they shall be called the holy people, the redeemed or avenged of Yahweh. And so you shall be called well sought, the city which is not forsaken. Now, the idea of being thoroughly searched for, well sought out, ties right back to the idea of the city that is forsaken. But now it's going to be called not forsaken. So these verses tie back up to the front of the chapter and make a nice way of closing out the chapter. And since the audience that is addressed by the prophet would be more likely to be those in the city than the exiles that are far away, then I really like Claus Westermann's concept that the people in Jerusalem were being summoned to go out, to leave through the city's gates in order to prepare the way for the people, that is, the exiles, whose return was long awaited. So, did you notice the similarity between these verses and Isaiah 40, verse 3? What if I said verse 10? Did you notice the similarity of verse 11 to Isaiah chapter 40 and verses 9 following? Now, think just for a moment of how that would apply to the church. How are we supposed to prepare the way? If I were teaching this week, I'd close out the session by drawing parallels between the imagery of the final verses and our evangelical and mission tasks, which are very much alive today.